All right, guys, I'm not afraid to admit when I make a mistake, and that did happen in the last video. You guys caught it, and thankfully so, because I'm actually able to fix the problem before it kind of becomes an issue later on down the road. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out the last video. But basically, when we were installing the 4.8 back into this Silverado, we're doing a 4.8 versus 8.1 shootout, and the engine is just about done. But when I was going to install it into the truck, I used ARP fasteners to hold on the flex plate. Now, normally when you use an ARP bolt or a stud or something like that, you're putting heads on, you're supposed to put the ultra torque assembly lube on the threads of the fastener as well as underneath the head. And that'll just give you a really accurate torque when you're using a torque wrench. But in a fastener that has a lot of vibration, for example, the flex plate bolt on an LS, the instructions are actually pretty specific about what they want you to do, and it does not say to use ultra torque on the threads and under the head. It actually tells you to use Loctite 242 on the threads, and then under the head of the bolt use ultra torque. Now, I actually showed you guys these instructions on the screen just to kind of show the torque reading, but if I would have taken the time to actually read them, I would have read that it says to use Loctite. Now, the reason why I'm going through the effort to correct this problem now is because in the past I actually have had flex plate and flywheel bolts back out. And if you have an engine that has a lot of vibration, for example, a 292 inline 6, and if you don't use really good Loctite on the threads, well, the flywheel or flex plate bolts can back out. And to fix it, you've got to either pull the engine or pull the transmission. And I should have remembered that lesson, but I was in a rush, whatever. I wanted to get the video up before Thanksgiving, and it totally didn't even occur to me. It slipped my mind. So we're fixing it now. I went ahead and I pulled everything apart. I took the bolts and I put them in the parts washer and I cleaned them up real good, and then I put them, sprayed them with brake cleaner. So these bolts are super, super clean. There's no oil at all on these guys. And as far as the crankshaft, I took the same brake cleaner, just sprayed out the holes really, really well. The only thing to keep in mind, though, is these holes are drilled through the crankshaft. It's not a blind hole. So you do wind up with some brake cleaner in the oil pan, but I just popped the drain plug and it just all ran right out. So not a huge deal. I hadn't filled this with oil yet, but the short version is we have all these threads completely clean and dry. All these threads are clean and dry, and now we get to put it back together again with a Loctite 242 medium strength thread locker on the threads only. And then under the head of the bolt there, we are still going to use the ultra torque according to the instructions. So that's my little lesson for the day. I guess just don't make assumptions, read the instructions, and do everything like you're supposed to. So let's get this fixed. Well, we're right back at the same exact spot we were at the end of the very last video, except now we have the correct thread locker on the flex plate bolt. So we have the motor mounts tightened down. I have all the bell housing bolts in and torqued. I have the little clip for the fuel lines run, or not run, but I have it installed on the little bolt slash stud thing. Those are kind of a pain to get to. The dipstick is tightened down on the one stud on the passenger side. The torque converter bolts are in, and I'll make a quick note on the torque converter pullout. On the last video, I just put a little footnote on the screen because when I was doing one of these little on-cam things here, I couldn't do math on the fly. I said there was 250 thousandths or a quarter of an inch clearance between 850 and an inch, which is actually only 150 thousandths. So my on-the-fly math was off. But after I got everything put together, I double-checked the measurement, and the actual spacing between the actual pullout between the torque converter and the flex plate as measured is 95 thousandths of an inch. Now that's using the 120 thousandths inch spacer that came with the kit. And when I put the thin spacer in, because I did it both ways just to kind of double check, with the thin 60 thousandths spacer, and it works out to be like 155 thousandths of pullout. And so I just kind of decided I would much rather have that pullout dimension be a little bit on the tight side rather than on the loose side, because spec from kind of what you read is like 125 thousandths. It probably would be fine either way with the thin or the thick spacer, or honestly, you could probably get away with running no spacer at all. But, you know, the specified or the recommended distance of pullout is about 125 thousandths. We're at 95 thousandths. So like I said, I'd rather be on the short side of that, which means there's a little more engagement into the pump rather than on, 30 thousandths loose, which means the torque converter is pulled out of the pump. So there's a little bit less engagement there. Anyway, that's where my clearances are set. Everything is checked, torqued, Loctited, including Loctite on the torque converter bolts that hold it to the flex plate. So now we can move on, and the next thing I'm going to take care of real quick is torquing down the balancer bolt. Not really a super exciting process, but a few things worth noting there. The original fastener is a torque to yield. You're not supposed to reuse it. I know some people do, but for the price of these bolts, I think they're like 10 bucks. It makes sense just to get a new one. Now, since we're on the topic of like thread compounds, Loctite or not, the factory instructions, from what I can tell, make no mention of any sort of a thread locking compound or a lubricant on these threads. That's just what I've read. They just pretty much tell you to put it in dry. For example, if they wanted Loctite, they would have put it on the bolt to begin with. This is a factory GM flex plate bolt, and it comes with this little kind of teal green thread locking / sealing compound already on it. So they don't put anything on the thread, so we're going in dry there. But they do put this orange stuff on here. I'm not quite sure what that is, whether it's some sort of a lubricant or a sealant maybe, but we're going to put the bolt in dry. Because this is a torque to yield bolt, we need to make it, I think the spec is 37 pound-feet of torque, and then you need to turn an additional 140 degrees of rotation, which I think you're not supposed to torque it to a spec, but the rough torque is going to be, somewhere in the mid 200 pound-feet of torque range. So you got to really crank on this thing, and if possible, it's easy to do it just one shot rather than turning a little bit, backing up a ratchet, and then turning it again. You do need to measure it, and so I picked up a inexpensive torque angle meter. This basically is just a short socket extension with that little lever arm on there, and that'll make this little needle kind of move around. Once again, 140 degrees of rotation is what we're going for, and we need to hold the engine stationary. And I also picked up another tool. This is something I grabbed from Amazon, pretty inexpensive. It's just a little flywheel holder. It bolts on, let's see, probably kind of like that into the starter bolts, and you can see it's got teeth on there that'll engage into the flex plate to stop the engine from turning over, which you really got to somehow lock it down if you're going to be torquing a bolt like this. And whether or not you use a torque to yield, even if you bought like an ARP crank bolt, this definitely would come in handy, because I think for the ARP one, the torque spec is once again like well into the 200 pound-foot range. So anyway, let me get the crankshaft locked out with that little starter tool, and then we'll tighten the bolt. safe to say we made a fair amount of progress today, and we're just about ready to fire this thing up for the first time. And I mean, I say just about ready, but in reality, there are quite a few things that I am going to be doing. Now, if this were just a stock engine replacement, we're actually pretty close because I could just put everything back in the way that it came out. But two major things that we got to do before we fire it up. Number one, build a custom exhaust. That's going to be the big time suck. And the second thing, not too bad, we're going to be doing an electric fan conversion. But yeah, those are the two things we have left to accomplish before we start it and start the tuning process and things like that. But here's kind of where we're at, guys. I just finished up by putting the upper core support crash bar, whatever you want to call that thing. We just got that in place so I can start building out the front end of the truck. I can put the new radiator in and get the electric fans mounted. In terms of wiring, that's kind of what I spent the last little while doing. And it's just about complete. There are a few things that are not attached yet. For one, the throttle body. As you can see, is kind of old and gunky and dirty, so I am going to take that off and clean it up. That's why I didn't plug the throttle body in. I left the alternator off just because that gives a little bit more access to the throttle body. Important things to note, I guess, if you're putting one of these in, it's easy to forget a few things. There's a couple of grounds. There's one on each back side of the engine. Those are important because those ground, sensors and things like that. There's, I guess, two grounds down here in this corner, kind of on the side of the block. There's a engine harness ground and there's a battery cable ground, so those are important. Finally, there's a ground strap. That guy right back there goes from the firewall to the back of the cylinder head. Also important. I've seen a lot of guys who, they put a new engine in, they can't figure out why it's not running right. And sometimes it's just as simple as forgetting a ground, because there are a lot, and for the electrical systems to work like they should, you gotta have all the grounds in place. So don't forget those. Other than that, I do like to spend some time. I am pretty fussy about how the wiring is routed, and I want to make sure it goes back in exactly the factory position, because they spend a lot of time with stuff like these little clips here just to make sure nothing like rubs or chafes or gets in a spot where it's not supposed to be. And that's especially true for the part of the harness that routes underneath the oil pan down there. That is a bit tricky to kind of get back in the factory location because there's a certain spot where it kind of one flips over the other. But anyway, we've got that all in. The starter is not mounted yet, as you can kind of do this with one hand, focus down there. But all the wiring is run. Like you can see the crank sensor there. You can see the rest of the wires just hanging out, waiting for the starter. But I am going to get that thing cleaned up because it is pretty nasty. A bunch of oil and stuff kind of was dripping on it. What's going on here? We zoomed in for some reason. Okay, so radiator, we are putting the wider 34-inch radiator in to do the electric fan conversion. I'll handle that at some point. Between now and the next video, I'm just going to get the front end of the truck built out because you guys don't really care to see, headlights and marker lights and the grill going back on. Transcooler for now, we're just going to run this one, although I am going to be switching to a TrueCool 40K, just like I did on the other truck. Let's see, what else was I going to talk about? Oh, that torque to yield bolt on the balancer. 140 degrees of rotation is a lot. And I had to get the cheater pipe out because that was like super mega tight, and there's absolutely no way I would have been able to do that unless I had the flywheel locked out with this guy. So well worth the investment in the flywheel holder and the little torque angle meter. Without these two things, you definitely couldn't do it. And even if you did have an ARP balancer bolt, you wouldn't need that. You definitely still need that guy. So I'll put the links in the description for both of those items. Definitely useful, inexpensive, and a good thing to add to your toolbox. Let's see, the plan for here on out, I think in the next video I'll start with the exhaust because that's one of the biggest time-consuming things that we have left to do. So we'll start on the exhaust, get that built. I think my plan is, this probably sounds a little crazy, it might be stupid, but I have an X pipe and I have a Y pipe and I want to run a 4-inch tailpipe. So I think what I'm going to do is run dual 3-inch from the headers into the X pipe, mainly because I like the sound of an X pipe. And then because I don't want to run dual tailpipes, I'm going to run a single. I have that big Flowmaster Hush Power Pro Series laminar flow, whatever they call it. I like the way that those sound, so I'm going to Y from the X pipe, so dual 3 into single 4-inch for the tailpipe. Now, that sounds a little ridiculous, and it might be. I don't know if the Y pipe will cancel out some of the sound that the X pipe makes. In theory, both a Y pipe and an X pipe will sort of introduce some scavenging effect. They might cancel each other out. They might not. I don't know. I'm just going to try it and see what happens. If it doesn't sound right, then I'll just put the two mufflers that I have on the, what were they? Oh, Spintex. I have two Spintex mufflers that I originally was going to put on. Anyway, that's what you guys have to look forward to. Drop a comment down below. Let me know how much horsepower you think this is going to make. My prediction is somewhere in the like 310 to 320 at the wheels. I think we'll maybe just barely get like 100 horse gain. In terms of torque, I think it'll be right around 300 pound-feet, maybe just a tiny bit less. But we'll see. It's kind of, that's part of the whole experiment, right? Is we are going to see how much horsepower we can make with a sort of somewhat spent budget. So thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate you guys. Do me that favor, drop the comment, subscribe to the channel, click the like button. Those all help. And stay tuned because we have some more cool content coming on this 4.8 LS build.